everyone. Welcome. I hope that everyone is doing well, staying safe. Everyone's staying at home, of course. My name is Maddie, if you've never been here before. I live in Paris, or just a little bit outside. And so, as hopefully everyone else is, I've been, self-isolating, social distancing. So I've been getting into a lot of book YouTube, just seeing what everyone's reading, watching recommendations. So I thought it would be kind of fun if perhaps I could do a little reading video today. I'm going to be talking about the first 10 books that I read this year. So I'm actually really excited. I love reading. I've always loved reading, and I'm kind of always looking for recommendations and things like that. So hopefully this book can help you too. And if you're wondering why I'm sitting on the floor, I don't know, it just felt right. So let's just go with it. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's start. Okay, so first of all, what's important to note is that I read most of my books on my Kindle. This is like my prized possession. I got this for my 16th birthday, so it has so many books on it. I got into like a battle royale with Amazon last summer because I lost my login and I thought I was gonna lose all my books, but that's not important. So anyways, let's get to the books. Okay, so the first book I read this year was on my Kindle, and it was Circe by Madeline Miller. Okay, so basically this is a book that kind of tells the tale of Circe, the kind of nymph witch, who you probably know her because she's the one who Odysseus gets kind of stranded on her island, and I can't remember in the classic tale if they like fall in love, but anyways, he ends up staying there for like 5 years, and she turns all of his men into pigs. So that's probably where you know her from. But this book kind of builds out her world more and talks about kind of like why she does the things that she does, and talks about all of her experiences. And in short, like, I loved this book. Like, it was one of those books that whenever I would get on the bus or the train, like, I couldn't wait, or when I was in bed at night, I couldn't wait to get out my Kindle and like keep reading it. It's just so beautifully crafted. Like, you're just immersed in this gorgeous world of the gods and the goddesses. And I had definitely been on kind of a mythology kick. I read In Odyssey by Daniel Mendelsohn kind of toward the end of last year, I think, or maybe last summer. And so it kind of just got me thinking about mythology and things like that. It's super interesting. I loved the characters. I really love books when it kind of makes you think about characters in a different way than maybe you've thought about them before. But I loved that book. Like, I could not recommend it enough. Also, a quick note, I got this book, the idea to read it, off of the PBS NewsHour / New York Times Now Read This book club. So definitely check out that list for amazing books. They always have great books. I love it. So yeah. Okay, so book number 2, this was a physical book. I read Mythology by Edith Hamilton. So this is basically just like a comprehensive kind of like review of mythology. It kind of goes through all the characters, the families, a few like stories. I will say the only thing about reading this just after Circe was so like fun, and the characters were so interesting, and this is more just like cut and dry, like what is the story, like who are they, who are their parents, things like that. So this one was a little bit harder to read just because it was just a little bit more dry coming off of Circe. But definitely if you're looking for kind of like a comprehensive overall view of mythology, this is definitely a good one. It literally says the classic bestseller, and then it's the timeless tales of gods and heroes. So it's definitely a good one for sure. Okay, so the next one, this one I'm excited to talk about. The third book I read this year was Normal People by Sally Rooney. So this book follows Connell and Marianne, and they are in Ireland, and it kind of follows them it follows their relationship from high school until university years, I think a little bit after university. But the reason why I love this book so much, and why I loved Conversations with Friends also by Sally Rooney, is because you kind of start the book thinking, oh, it's gonna be this one thing, it's gonna be this kind of stereotypical love story or this kind of cliche tale, but then it just turns into something so different, and the characters are so, like, the characters in both of her books are so intriguing. They just kind of defy any of the norms of what you would kind of think of like relationships or I don't know, it's so hard to say. It's like, but like really I would highly recommend both of her books, just because the characters are so complex. It's a pretty like easy read, like I mean, but it definitely, I don't know, I just love these books. I don't know how else to say it. They were just a really interesting look at love and relationships. So highly would recommend Normal People and Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. And then they're also making Normal People into a show on Hulu, so that's kind of exciting. So I'm excited to see kind of what they do with the show. Okay, so my fourth book I read this year was Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. So this was a book I brought back to France after I was home for the holidays, and my mom had read this. I was introduced to Malcolm Gladwell through his podcast, Revisionist History, which definitely I have been such a big fan of. There are definitely some episodes that I love more than others, but ultimately it's really intriguing. It kind of talks about like things that we haven't really done a deep dive on in the past, and just things that he thinks that need a deeper dive. Like for example, one episode he talks about American football and how he thinks in 20 years we're gonna look back on that and be like, oh my gosh, why were we doing that? Because it's causing so many young men, a lot of like mental health issues and brain damage. That's really interesting. But anyways, back to the book. Okay, so Talking to Strangers. So this one, the full title is Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know. So it's basically talking about talking to strangers and about how we think we understand strangers. Like we think we understand how people operate, we think we can read people, but ultimately that's not true at all. Like we actually are horrible at reading people, and by thinking that we can understand other people, like we know when you're lying, we know when you're telling the truth, it can have really awful consequences. And it goes into some pretty serious topics like torture, spies, just things like that. So it's really interesting. But there's a chapter about the Stanford swimmer, like the rape case, and kind of talking about people in college, how people in college are drinking themselves to a point where you can't have an exchange of consent and you can't read each other's intentions, and I don't know, it's pretty interesting stuff. Like it's good. So I definitely would recommend this too. I haven't read any of his other books, so if you have read his other books and like them, let me know. But this was an interesting read for sure. And I do love a nonfiction book, so that's good. Okay, so next one. This is an exciting one to talk about also. So the next book I read was Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. So this was a reread for me. I read this in college. It was actually for a class, Intro to Fiction, my freshman year. Probably my favorite book my favorite class I took in college. I went to the University of Kansas. So the reason why I was inspired to reread this is because I started the HBO series, and it's actually set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I'm from. The book is not, but I was just thinking about it so much, and I was like, wow, I really loved that graphic novel. Maybe I should reread it. So I did, and I was not disappointed. Okay, so it's a graphic novel. That means that it's like a comic, basically. It has drawings and things like that, and they are, first of all, I mean, they're beautiful. They're gorgeous, the colors are gorgeous, and the story is just so complex. Basically, it's in the time where so it kind of jumps back and forth between two time eras, between like kind of this golden age of like superheroes, and then also past that age when they banned superheroes. But it's not like your typical, like, if you're thinking of it's like a Marvel comic, with like superheroes, it's a lot darker than that. I mean, there's a lot of really dark things that happen in here. There's a lot of dark themes, but it's a super interesting story. about kind of like, it's on the and it's also like it's a kind of a alternate universe where like Robert Redford is the president. The US and Russia, they're on the brink of war, and it's basically just kind of how everyone's dealing with that. But I think what's so interesting about reading a graphic novel is there's so much complexity. Like when you open up to a page, you can, I mean, like it takes you so long, like you can read so much into everything. Like you can read all the newspapers, what are the newspapers saying, like things like that. So that's really interesting. And yeah, so I think if you've never read this, definitely read it, it's great. And also if you've never seen the HBO show, I like loved it. I thought it was so interesting. It takes place basically like after this, after the graphic novel, but it kind of has similar themes, and I just think it was so smartly done. Regina King is literally amazing, so check it out. I'm literally losing my voice. I haven't talked this much in a minute, so keep the spine facing out, keep it aesthetic. Okay, so the next one is Say Nothing, the true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. So this was another nonfiction book that I read on my Kindle. Okay, so I read this at the recommendation of a friend, and okay, this story, so basically it kind of starts with the abduction of a mother in Northern Ireland in 1972, and it basically goes through like the troubles in Northern Ireland, this kind of conflict period that literally went on for like, I think like 30 years. And what's so interesting is I was not super familiar with this history, like what was going on. I obviously knew that there was a Catholic Protestant conflict in Northern Ireland, but I just had no idea the extent of it. I had no idea that they were like going to London, planting bombs. So it was so fascinating to kind of like get this take on it. I also think what's really interesting is when I think of like prejudice or things like that, like I tend to think of like racially, something of that more like racially. So it's kind of interesting to think of like religious, what's the word I'm looking for? Prejudice? Oh, discrimination. Oh my god. Okay. So it's really interesting to kind of see how much violence there was, and I mean it's just like a crazy story. I like 10 out of 10 would recommend that book. It's such a fascinating part of history that I was really not familiar with. So definitely check it out. I highly recommend. Okay. Oh, and of course like the Troubles, also a big part of that is the IRA and things like that. So yeah. Okay, so the next book that I read was Verity by Colleen Hoover. Okay, so this was another recommendation from a friend, and so how do I don't know. So I wanted something that was gonna be like a quick, easy read because Say Nothing was so heavy. It's pretty long, it's dense, there's so much information, there's a lot of people, a lot of things happen, you're following different stories, and I mean, it's just like a bummer. But so, Verity basically, it's like, okay, so it follows the story of this woman named Lowen, I think is her name. Why didn't I look that up before? Okay, anyways, and she's a writer, and she goes to work for this like famous writer and her husband. The famous writer's name is Verity, but she's been in a car accident. She can't complete her series of novels, so Lowen is brought in to finish the novels, and she goes and lives with the family, and she's like, you know, and it's a thriller for sure. And there's like some things that happen, you're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Like if you want like a quick, easy thriller that's kind of like, oh my gosh, like that, yeah, like it's pretty good. Some of the writing was a little cringe. Like there's just some lines that were like, whenever he looks at me, I feel like he sees me, and things like that, where I was just kind of like, okay. And also like I guessed the ending. Okay, I'm like very good at guessing plots, like the ending of kind of books if they're super easy, obviously, and I don't like that. Like I like to be surprised. I like to like learn things. I just like a really like complex book, like something that I can like really like sink my teeth into, and which is kind of funny because this is like isn't what I wanted. Like I didn't want another complex book, so I read this and then I was disappointed. But still, like it was pretty intriguing. Like I wouldn't not recommend it, but it wasn't my favorite book. I would say of the books that I've read so far, the first 10 books that I read, this was my least favorite book that I read. But like still, it was like a pretty good book, so like it's good. Okay, so the next one, we're going back to kind of another heavy nonfiction book. But so the next book I read was American Prison by Shane Bauer, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment. Okay, so this is another one I read on my Kindle, and this book was so interesting. So Shane Bauer, he literally got a job at a prison in Louisiana. Like, he didn't use a fake name. He was super upfront. But the reason why he went undercover is because if you try to gain access to a prison, and in this book specifically, he's talking about for-profit prisons. So if you try to get access to these prisons, they're gonna kind of give you the company line. They're going to maybe give you a tour, but it's only gonna be certain sections, and obviously they're gonna be prepared for you. So I think it's just really hard to get kind of an honest, an honest look at prisons, and it's hard to report on prisons. So he decides, I'm gonna go get a job there, and I'm just gonna like get right down to it. And what's also very interesting is he brought a recorder. He brought a pen in that had a recorder, and he brought a camera on his water bottle. So everything that he has is recorded. So I think that gives him so much credibility, because he's not just like, oh, I think I remember, and like taking notes. No, he has the recordings, which is so interesting. And he does differentiate, because I think in the beginning he was scared, but literally just for like the very first small part of the book, he talks about how he was scared to bring in his recorder. So on those parts, I think it's like everything that's in italics is him just note-taking, but everything that's in quotes is he has recordings. So that's really interesting. But of course, as you can imagine, it's pretty upsetting. It's like an upsetting look. The whole private prison system is so, like, just beyond. I mean, in the beginning of the book, there's a passage, and I thought it was taken from like the times of slavery. It was literally in like 1960s Texas, because basically the way the system was founded is it was a way to kind of like make slavery legal. I just think any time that you have motivation from money, like there's gonna be corruption. Like, of course, like, I mean, if you're motivated to have people in prison, you're gonna find a way to put people in prison. But I don't know, there's just, like, the world isn't black and white, and I think that you kind of get more of like a look into that in this book. You kind of, I don't know, just really I don't think that, I mean, like, I believe in justice. Like, let me tell you, like, I believe in people paying their time. I believe in punishment. I believe if you do a horrible crime, like, you need to pay that punishment, like, whatever. I have no issue with justice in general, but I think there are some instances where it's like, is this justice? Like, do we need to treat people like dogs? Why am I getting into this? Okay, let's move on. I'm gonna have to cut so much of that out. Okay, so the 9th book I read this year was Chanson Douce. Oh, my little Shakespeare & Co. Bookmark fell out. But okay, so this is Chanson Douce by Leila Slimani. Okay, so this is a French book. That is not a flex though. Like, this took me so long to read. I definitely, one of my New Year's resolutions was to make my French better. You know, we're getting there. Okay, so I saw Chanson Douce in the theater with my friend. She had read the book before, and I actually really liked the movie. So basically the premise is it's about a nanny, and this isn't a spoiler, the book starts with this. So the book starts with the first line is okay, excuse my French, is le bébé est mort. The baby is dead. Il a suffi de quelques secondes. It only took a few seconds. Am I gonna leave that in? That was literally so embarrassing. Okay, so basically it's like the baby is dead. That's the first line of the book. So you're like, what happened? So basically it's about this nanny who kills the kids. Like, that's the first chapter. It's not a spoiler. In her French family that she's nannying for. I mean, she's an older woman, but so it's basically kind of talking about the circumstances that led her to that moment, about like her life. The reason why this is such a compelling book to me is because obviously I would never murder children, but there are certain aspects of this book, like being a nanny, that I was like, yep. Like there's certain aspects of like being a nanny for a French family that are so like you can like see yourself in this because you're like, yeah, that's real, like that actually happened. But anyways, it is translated into English. It's called The Perfect Nanny. I couldn't find Chanson Douce, like the French title, in my Goodreads, so I have it in English, The Perfect Nanny, on my Goodreads, which I will link below so you guys can follow along if you want. But yeah, I would definitely recommend. It's very intriguing. It's kind of an interesting look at her life and her family life. 10 out of 10 would recommend. You can read it in English. That's great. So my 10th and final book. We've made it. I've been talking so much. Okay. My 10th and final book that I finished this year is the 5th season. So it's book number 1 from the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. Okay, so I'm currently reading the 3rd book in the series, so obviously I liked it. So this is like a fantasy, like a sci-fi book, which is really different for me. I don't typically read fantasy, but it was the first book was a recommendation from the Now Read This book club. So I was like, you know what, I'll give it a try. And it definitely, I don't know, okay, so it definitely took me kind of a while to like settle in to how it was written, because I think that when I think of like fantasy, kind of like dystopian books, I think of like The Hunger Games, like Divergent, like super easy, fast. These books are obviously, I mean, they're like adult fantasy, so it's like a little bit, I mean, like it's obviously super complex, but basically, so the premise is it's in this kind of like world, so it's in this place called the Stillness, which is basically like all of the land, and they have these things called seasons every however many years where there's like this horrible kind of natural disaster where a bunch of people are wiped out, a bunch of people die, like a volcano erupts, so it's like a horrible earthquake. So that's like the 5th season is when there's a season where it's like really bad in the Stillness. It's a very like complicated book to try to explain, which I'm realizing now, but basically there's some people in the Stillness that are origins, I hope I'm saying it right, which is basically like they can like move the earth with their mind, and they can like feel the earth and like assess the earth. And so some of them are trained, but if they aren't in, but a lot of people fear them if they aren't trained at this certain place. Like if they're just like found out by their like neighbors, they're feared because they can like really hurt people if they aren't sure. It's very complicated. You can definitely tell that there's a lot of, like, she's definitely taken a lot of kind of like real world experiences and feelings and kind of like social topics. I don't know how to say it, like social topics, and she's made them into this book. Like for example, the origins, the people who can like move things, so they have like their proper name, which is the origins, but they're also called ragas, which is kind of like a more like a slang, like it's like a negative term. So I think that could kind of like be like an allegory, I think. I don't know. I hope I'm not putting my foot in my mouth for like the N-word and things like that. But I think what's also interesting about this book, specifically the first one, is it has like some different characters, like maybe like a transgender character. There's a lot of kind of like interesting ideas about like sexuality and things like that. There's just a lot of different levels to it, a lot of richness. And what's interesting is she said that she was inspired to start writing this book after the riots in Ferguson, after Michael Brown was killed. So that's really interesting. And so that's kind of like in the first chapter, her son is killed. So I think that kind of sparks a lot of it off, and I think it's really interesting to kind of base fantasy in like real world. Okay, so I'm done. I hope that you guys liked this. I hope that you thought it was interesting. I hope that you, if you're looking for some recommendations, you found something that you like and maybe you'll pick something up. Let me know if you have any other questions about the books. I love talking about books. I'm always looking for recommendations. I'm always like looking for different things to read. I have like a notes page on my phone of all the different books I want to read. So if you have any books that you're like, I think that you would enjoy this, let me know. And like I said before, stay safe, guys. Stay inside. Take care of each other, and take care of yourself. So thank you guys so much for listening. And and I will link like I said, I will link my Goodreads down below if you want to see, like, keep up with my reading. And thank you guys so much. I will see you next time.